Welcome back to the Happy Saver podcast. I'm Ruth, a personal finance blogger living in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in this podcast, I chat with a diverse bunch of people, I learn their story, and then I just condense it down so that you can hear helpful, relatable stories from Kiwis and the odd Australian who are sharing their experiences about their personal finance in New Zealand. So thank you so much for letting me join you on your commute, your walk, your run, or while you get some jobs done around your house. Today we are hearing from Petra, a woman who has bounced her way from the UK to Australia and then to New Zealand, and back and forth a few times too. Never say never, but for now, Auckland is home. Work brought her here, work introduced her to her husband James, but now, aged 60 and widowed about 5 years ago, the hardest work she has ever done is rebuilding her life without the love of her life beside her. A private person, so these are not their real names, she wanted to share her financial story because others who have done the same on the Happy Saver podcast have been a huge help to her. So she wants to try to do the same for someone else. But before I really get into it, I've just got a quick message from today's fabulous sponsor. When I first started to get interested in understanding where my money came from and went to, I meticulously noted each transaction in a spreadsheet. While a good place to start, I was short on time, and that practice lasted 1 month at best. Enter Pocketsmith. It helped me quickly automate my finances, which saved a ton of time. I like to explain Pocketsmith to people by saying it gave me the data I desperately needed to understand my money. I no longer have to compile that data, it does everything for me. Pocketsmith automates financial management by connecting to your financial institutions, such as your bank, for real-time transaction updates. Plus, it offers budgeting tools, cash flow forecasts, and net worth tracking, thus eliminating the need for manual spreadsheets. Thank goodness. If you want to supercharge your finances with Pocketsmith, have we got a deal for you. Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of Pocketsmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/the Happy Saver. That's pocketsmith.com/the Happy Saver. Petra's British mother was visiting family in Australia when she met Petra's dad, an Italian who had moved there in the 1950s. When they had their first child in 1960, they actually returned to England to be closer to her family. Petra is the second youngest of 5 kids, and growing up, it was Petra's mum who managed the household finances, so she credits her with her ability to budget $1 today. Her mother taught her to make sure she had enough to pay the bills and a little left over for savings, demonstrating those simple money skills every day. Her dad was a shoemaker and a barber, but he actually suffered ill health, so although her mum was very resourceful and very canny with money, things were tight, with extended family often chipping in to help out. They lived in council houses until Petra was just 5 or 6, when her parents somehow purchased a house of their own for £2,000. And she has no idea how they scraped the money together, and although they didn't have much to come and go on, they were all fed, warm and loved. Her parents were 2 very different people when it came to money. While her mum budgeted and planned ahead, her dad sometimes spent money recklessly, leading to occasional arguments. And it was only years later when Petra married her husband James that she realised as far as money management was concerned, she had married her father. But during her own marriage, Petra decided early on that, as annoying as it was to have unplanned purchases show up unannounced on the credit card and her pleas to stop when unheard, it would not be something that they would argue about. What she did take with her into her life, though, was a love of numbers, a real enjoyment of being in charge of her finances, and later of theirs. In 1980, when Petra was just 14, her family moved to Melbourne, Australia, and her dad had yearned to move back there, and he was the advance party, moving first with 2 of her siblings and getting things set up before Petra and the rest of the family joined them. Now, as you might imagine, it was a huge culture shock, albeit a very warm one, to move from England to Australia, and Petra vowed she wouldn't do the same thing to her future children. Spoiler alert, she did. Now, she finished school in the mid-1980s, and with no idea of what she wanted to do, she went to secretarial college, which got her a job as a library assistant/tea lady in the head office of a gold mining company in Melbourne, which was fantastic, she said. A whole other world where she was mixing with office workers through to geologists. What advice might Petra have for a teenager leaving school with no clue what to do next? Well, she thinks it's a good idea to go out into the world and just get a job, any job, and save some money and just get to experience another culture or two. Open your eyes, she said. The reason is that unless you have a burning desire to do a particular profession, you really don't know what you want. And after a year or two of work and travel, just see where your head is at and then move in the direction of what took your interest during those 1 to 2 years. While she studied, which was all paid for with her own cash, and then worked, she lived at home and saved most of her money by handing it over to her mum, who put it away for safekeeping, leaving Petra with just a little bit of travel entertainment money. Now, I still know of many parents who do this for their young adult children. While they are still developing the skills to manage money, they hand most of it to their parents to manage for them, and then, as they get themselves more organised with life and with money, they take over control. Now, if both parties agree and the younger person is fully aware of where their money is and how much is there, then it is a way to stop them from blowing the lot if they are that way inclined. Next, Petra signed up for a 3-year course in clothing manufacturing and design in Melbourne, and due to her cash savings and working while she studied, she managed a bit of travel over those years too, all done on the smell of an oily rag, and to keep costs down, she mostly lived at home while she did study. But when she was done, aged about 22, she moved to Sydney and landed a job as a pattern maker for an Australian clothing company where Petra got to see and learn the entire process from sourcing raw materials to getting the products made and selling their goods in the Australian market. She was drawn to one area of the business in particular, which was the buying of the fabrics and all the accessories that went into manufacturing clothing, which steadily led her towards working in the women's wear division at a company called Big W at the age of 25. Australia is known these days for its very good superannuation schemes, and I asked if this was something that she was aware of in the early 1990s. It was not compulsory then as it is now, but she does remember someone coming into her office to sell a superannuation product and insurance. She and many of her colleagues signed up. Clearly, they explained enough for her to trust them to sign up, but she said that looking back, she really has no idea what it was. Otherwise, she just budgeted her income and paid her bills, invested in her superannuation, always with some left for savings. It was very simple and things just ticked along. It was in this company that her regular visits to the IT department meant that she met James. They got to talking and he said he wrote short stories and asked if she would like to read one over lunch, and things progressed. She hesitated, he won her over, and that was that. They were a loved-up couple from then on. A year younger than her, James had worked in the company longer than her and had a higher income than she did. He worked a 4-on, 4-off roster, and already aged just 24, he had actually purchased a rural property with a mortgage outside Sydney that he regularly visited on his days off. And when he was in the city for work, he rented a room in a mate's house. She said that although he made good money, his mortgage left him with none to spare. And one of the key reasons for this was the eye-wateringly high interest rates, as high as about 17% due to the 1990s recession in Australia. Now, despite these high lending rates, as soon as they got engaged in their mid-20s, he wanted to keep the house in the country and buy another house with her, which they did in late 1992. Thankfully, interest rates were already dropping by then. But I had to ask, how did they afford this? Well, it was the bank looking at their incomes and his other property that secured the mortgage on a house worth $165,000. She thinks that she might have cashed in her fledgling superannuation account because, being so young, she just couldn't even fathom that she might one day retire, so she couldn't see the potential of that investment anyway. And his mum had given them a little money towards a deposit too, she thinks. Plus, they rented out the house in the countryside for a bit of income. She soon learned that James wasn't that keen on confrontation around money when his renter was a bit hit and miss with paying the rent, the income they were desperate for to cover the 2 mortgages. So it was Petra who pushed the tenant to pay on time. Whenever they moved houses over the years, he would say, "We can only afford to take on this mortgage if we can continue to make payments if interest rates get to 18%, because that is what he lived through with his first property. Talk about stress testing your capacity to pay. Now, I asked why there was a push to buy property so young and so quickly too, and she explained that it felt cheaper to buy than rent. And who is to say that back in the 1990s in Australia it wasn't? I simply don't know. But at that time, Petra and James were following in the footsteps of his parents. As soon as you could buy a property, you did. You just didn't question it. You had to get on the property ladder. Having their own home made them feel secure, and in Petra's head, she thought they would eventually sell the rural property, which was now a rental, and pay down the mortgage on the Sydney house, which they eventually did. They married in 1993, and from the get-go, just like her own parents, they thought of their money as one. They combined their finances with both of their incomes going into a joint bank account, and much like her mum did, Petra managed the money for the 2 of them. She could see that James didn't think about money that much. As long as there was enough in the bank, he didn't think too hard about what he spent. And he was more than happy with this arrangement, as he knew the bills would be well handled by Petra, and with a double income coming in, they certainly were. James had joined the company's superannuation scheme, and with that came some life insurance. And when superannuation became compulsory in the early 1990s, she joined it too. The company they worked for offered shares as part of an employee share plan, and initially he got $3,000 worth and she got $1,000 worth, and over time they received many more shares. From chatting with Petra, it sounded like their money had a flow to it, and they talked about things when things came up, but there was never a goal or a plan, which is pretty standard for most people, I think. Once they had run the math and talked about it, they would just move on. From their very first mortgage together, and for the ones that came after, she made sure that they always paid more than the bank's minimum payment. This way they paid off more principal over time, which meant that their equity grew. Yes, that equity was trapped in a house, but given his penchant for spending $1 and her desire to always save some, this was a way for her to force some savings. Now, strangely, in the past fortnight, I've actually had 2 separate conversations with people who told me that they prefer to keep a mortgage because it, quote, forces them to save. In fact, they had actively put themselves back into debt for this very reason, which I will admit had me scratching my head a little. What they seem to mean is that unless a bank is standing over them demanding repayments, they don't trust themselves to regularly take a portion of their income and put it aside into some savings, or better yet, investments. But to me, that feels like short-term thinking and a behaviour worth challenging. So, how do you change this mindset? Well, you just start small. You open an account with a low-fee investment provider that offers a passive index fund or an ETF fund. You pick a massive global fund or a total world fund, and you just set up an automatic investment of, say, $20 a week. You make it automatic and you never stop, and you just continue paying down your mortgage as normal, but you let this investment quietly run in the background and you only check on it once a year. Don't sell it. And over time, you'll notice something quite important. Your investment balance will grow by more than just the money you put in, and that is the power of compounding. Your money begins making money all on its own, and perhaps most importantly, you'll start to realize that you can trust yourself to build wealth without needing to lock your money away to save yourself from yourself. Investing isn't about punishment or pressure, it's just about consistency and patience and just giving your money time to grow. Now, as she thought might happen, they sold the rural rental for not much more than what they paid, and they put the proceeds from the sale onto their Sydney mortgage. In 1994, Petra began working as a women's wear buyer, which is what brought them to New Zealand for the very first time. And interestingly, when she found out that she was pregnant just a few months later, her employer advised her to resign, something she fought back against. Instead, she had their first child in early 1995, taking maternity leave before returning to work in 1996. So thank you, Petra, and to women like you who stood your ground and paved the way for the rest of us to not have to quit our careers just because we had a baby. Now, they sold their home in Sydney for $220,000 because they intended to stay in New Zealand for the long term and they wanted to buy a home of their own here and they needed the money to do it. And now that they had a young child, they actually decided that one of them would always be home with them. And given James had been developing his artistic skills alongside his IT skills for the last few years, well, he felt this was an opportunity to blend parenting with creativity, which worked well for all of them. Because her role was busy and it had her travelling about 3 months a year. So having a stay-at-home parent really helped with this. Now, on one income, she was earning about $55,000 a year, which is about $150,000 in today's money. Plus, she had a company car, which is also a great saving. They put their cash for the house sale in the bank, and they actually ended up renting, which was very expensive, even back then, for 2 to 3 years in Auckland before eventually buying a home of their own in 1998. They paid $290,000 for a small Victorian bungalow, a lovely wee place, she said, and in 1999 she had their second child, and this time she felt like she wanted to spend some time at home with their kids and take a break from her full-on job. It was his turn to go back to work. Now, James tried to find a position in New Zealand, but he had no luck, so he did what Petra's parents did all those years ago. He moved back to Sydney by himself, back into a job with his old employer, and he began the hunt to find a place for his family to live in. Her job was to sell the Auckland house, which was a struggle due to the housing market being in a slump at the time, but it finally got sold for the price they bought it for, which is $290,000, and they took that money back to Australia, taking a hit with the exchange rate that worked against them this time. Now, they couldn't afford the metro area, so they paid $276,000 Australian dollars for a quarter-acre block, which was about 100 kilometres outside of Sydney, committing James to a long daily commute. But when everything was ready in mid-2000, Petra and the kids joined him, thus closing the door on a wonderful 5-year Kiwi experience. While he worked in the city, she parented, plus she picked up a part-time job in a local kidswear shop. Now, this was a huge change for Petra, giving up a career, a big job, and a part of her identity to take on this new life. And although it was her choice, she did struggle with that a little. But given she is a person to give things her full attention, in order to settle into a community full of locals who went back generations, she threw herself into volunteering at school and fundraising. And I know from once having a child at school that there is nothing better for the school PTA than a woman taking a break from a go-go corporate career, because these women get stuff done. Life was busy, with Petra and James doing all the things required to keep the wheels moving, and in 2003 she completed their family with their third child. But Aotearoa called to them, and his employer asked him and his family to take up a 3-year IT position back in New Zealand. They jumped on the opportunity and rented out the house and came back over here. Now, the great thing about being seconded is that it's a temporary transfer into a different role. As a result, the company covered their rent, they paid him in Australian dollars, they gave him a pay rise too, they contributed shares through the employee share scheme, and they paid into his Australian superannuation. On top of that, when they transferred money back to New Zealand, the exchange rate worked in their favour too. Now, financial opportunities like this don't come along often, and if used wisely and if you don't squander them, they can significantly leapfrog your financial position. Petra immediately saw the opportunity. Her thinking was spot on. Save hard and aggressively pay down the mortgage on their Australian house while enjoying free rent in New Zealand. By this stage, their Australian home was becoming too small for a family of 5, so the plan was that reducing or ideally eliminating the mortgage would put them in a strong position to either renovate or upsize when they returned to Australia 3 years later. But this is where things went off track a little. Instead of creating a clear plan for the extra income, lifestyle creep quietly absorbed it instead. And this is such an important lesson. If you don't have a plan for your money, you will spend it. The key is to immediately move that extra income from your bank account and deploy it elsewhere. into debt repayment or an investment. This way you don't see it and you don't get comfortable with it being there. They had an incredible opportunity in front of them, but instead of using it to build long-term wealth, much of the extra money simply disappeared into day-to-day living, which I don't think they regretted. They were living a very enjoyable life at that moment. Now, if you think rental property in New Zealand can get complicated, try talking to an Australian. There was hesitation to pay off the mortgage because there was some sort of interest deductibility tax situation going on. So what could have been a simple thing got complicated and therefore stalled. So spare money didn't get put towards the mortgage and it didn't get put into investments either. James had many passions in life, many creative projects on the go, and with money in the bank and more of it turning up each month, he was always buying bits and pieces for his projects, meaning Petra didn't know from one month to the next how much their life was costing. By this stage, as is common for many of us, their finances had become increasingly complex, and much of it was running on autopilot. They owned an Australian rental property, their former home, with all the tax incentives that encouraged them to keep debt attached to it, meaning they just made regular mortgage payments. James was automatically accumulating shares through his company's employee share scheme and had ticked the box to automatically reinvest the dividends. The shares were in his name, so he kept a vague eye on them, but not much more than that, and things just kind of ticked along. He was doing well in his career too, which meant regular bonuses were coming in, providing extra income for the family. He was also contributing the maximum amount possible into his personal Australian superannuation scheme, so another great form of investing. Now, when we were chatting for this podcast, I genuinely forgot to ask what he earned, but I don't think it means too much in the grand scheme of things because the gist is that from the outside, it all looked positive. The mortgage was being paid, money was going into superannuation, shares were quietly accumulating in the background, and the rental property was ticking along. But neither of them really knew the numbers involved. Petra managed the day-to-day household budget, but neither of them had a clear handle on the bigger picture, the value of those shares, the superannuation balances, the overall performance of the rental property, or how all these pieces fitted together into an actual financial plan. And this is where things can quietly drift. If you don't deliberately give your money a purpose, it tends to just disappear into lifestyle spending. In Petra's words, it can easily end up going on art supplies and fine wine. Overall, they thought, we're paying into super, paying the mortgage, things seem fine. And I think they were, all bases were covered. It didn't feel necessary to think too deeply about it all. But the problem with running your finances on autopilot is that years can pass before you realize you've missed an opportunity to use that money more intentionally. Now, for the record, autopilot and set and forget are actually excellent investment strategies because they stop you meddling with things unnecessarily. But even with a simple system, you still need to schedule regular check-ins. For example, I update our net worth every month. It's an opportunity to eyeball each bank account, our KiwiSavers and our ETF investment, and keep track of how everything is performing over the months, years, and now even decades. That process has been incredibly important for Johnny and I because it confirms that we are still on track for the early retirement we planned for ourselves, while also making sure we're covering all of our bases along the way. Now, you don't need to obsess over your money every day, but you do need to pay attention to it because when you regularly check in, you spot problems earlier, you notice opportunity sooner, and you stay connected to the bigger purpose behind why you're saving and investing in the first place. For much of their marriage, Petra actually used a physical Collins cash book from her local stationery shop to manually track where their money was going each month. She had a good handle on everyday spending like groceries, electricity, and those household costs because she genuinely did enjoy tracking that data. And that is a great habit to have. But the downside of manually recording every expense is that you can spend so much time compiling the information that you never step back to actually use it to improve your financial position. Petra knew where the money was going day to day, but they weren't asking the bigger questions, like are we building wealth? Are we using our higher income intentionally? Are these investments moving us closer to the future we want? What future do we want? This is why I continue to personally use, and I keep mentioning Pocketsmith in my blog and podcast because they organise that data for me and I use it to shape my life, and I just can't speak highly enough about them. Part of the challenge was that Petra managed the money, but she never fully got James's buy-in. They simply had different money personalities. James didn't think deeply about money. As long as there was enough in the account to cover his spending, he assumed everything was fine. And that made it difficult for Petra to plan beyond the bills. She wanted to organise lump sum mortgage repayments, holidays and longer-term goals, but it's hard to move forward financially when only one person is steering the ship. So, what is the answer to getting your spouse on board financially? Petra admits that she doesn't really have one because every person and every relationship is different. What she does think, though, is that sometimes couples need an impartial third party to help them have the conversations that they can't seem to have on their own. She didn't want money to become a constant source of tension in their relationship. Plus, their high income papered over a lot of the spending cracks, so eventually she just let a lot of it go. Now, I too struggle to find the answers here, but this is something covered in the free online personal finance course, Rebel Finance School. Google it. They have a dedicated session during week 5, which is called How to Talk to Your Partner About Money Without Stress, Shame, or Arguments, and discuss how to get your partner more engaged with money in a way that feels constructive instead of confrontational. So track that one down. Even though Petra sometimes felt frustrated opening the credit card bill to another surprise purchase, she found it hard to truly resent James. He sounded like such a lovable rogue to me. Part of the reason she tracked their spending so carefully was to show him where the money was going, but James simply saw things differently. In his mind, he was often buying useful things for the family or genuinely useful gifts for the people he loved. And the truth was, he was a genuinely lovely man, she said, a great husband, devoted father, and someone without a malicious bone in his body, which made their money dynamic far more nuanced than one person being good with money and the other being bad. Now, when his work secondment ended in 2010, they reluctantly returned to Australia, even though New Zealand had stolen their hearts. Wanting more space for their growing family, in 2011, they sold their small Australian home that they had rented out. They sold it for $450,000 and they bought a much larger property for $950,000, taking on a $450,000 mortgage. To reduce the debt, he sold some company shares and they also bought Petra a brand new car for $30,000, complete with air conditioning, which felt essential in Australia. Now, she knew cars depreciate in value, but she justified it by planning to keep it for 10 years, and in the end, she actually drove it for 13. Now, it's a useful reminder though, most cars, the vast majority of cars, eventually end up worthless. If that same $30,000 had stayed invested or been invested into something like the Vanguard Total World ETF in 2011, Google tells me it would be worth around $145,000 today. Now, that is not to cast a shade on Petra at all. It's just a good example of how easy it is to sacrifice future wealth for lifestyle spending in the moment, especially when money feels comfortable. Looking back, she says upsizing the house probably wasn't the right move. If she had her time again, she would have kept the smaller house as a rental, rented a bigger place for themselves, and waited until they had a clearer long-term plan. But planning was never really their style. Life happened, they reacted, and they kept moving forward. They had friends who actually carefully mapped out their finances and retirement, and they would often say, we wish we were like that. Yeah, but we're not. What she's since learned is that the teacher arrives when the student is ready, and back then, they simply weren't ready. She returned to study, this time in interior design, and he returned to Woolworths, and in 2011 was earning a great monthly income of somewhere between $9,500 to $11,000 net, plus superannuation, plus an annual bonus most years. Despite appearing settled back in Australia, they were actually working hard to find a way back to Aotearoa, and in 2013 they finally did. Petra found a rental in Auckland, enrolled the children in schools, and he transferred to the New Zealand branch of the same company, this time earning in New Zealand dollars. Knowing the move would be a big adjustment and determined to give the children stability after so much change, Petra stayed home with them, something that she believes really paid off as all three are now happy adults, she said. Now, it was during their third stint in New Zealand in 2013 that Petra first learned about KiwiSaver. As a stay-at-home parent without her own income, she made voluntary contributions from their shared finances, which is a pretty smart move in hindsight. Meanwhile, he stopped contributing to his Australian superannuation, but he started to invest in his KiwiSaver instead, occasionally commenting on how much it had grown, but neither of them really understood what it was invested in or what fees they were paying. And it's a reminder that it still pays to check in regularly and understand where your money is sitting. The following year, in 2014, while the kids were at school, Petra began volunteering at a secondhand store. With her background in retail, her eye for design, and her love of secondhand shopping, she was a natural fit. And when the charity planned to open a new store, well, she secured a short-term contract to launch it. And the shop was an immediate success. And within just weeks, she was asked to manage it permanently. And from there, she actually quickly progressed to overseeing multiple stores, earning a modest income while finally putting many of the skills she loved to use. And it became an incredible opportunity for both Petra and the charity she worked with. To buy the New Zealand home Petra still lives in today, they sold their Australian property for $980,000, which is only $5,000 more than what they'd paid for it, and they took out a $450,000 mortgage in New Zealand. James had always wanted a rural bolt hole, and in late 2015 they purchased a second property for $300,000, a 40-acre lifestyle property, and they paid for it by selling more of the company shares. The land was just over an hour from their home, grazed by a neighbouring farmer, bringing in just $400 a month, but the purchase was really James's big dream. He wanted a place where he could build a small holiday home and have a large shed, a place where he could stay overnight and immerse himself in his many hobbies. Petra was far less enthusiastic, but she agreed because she knew how happy it would make him. And over time, with the help of a carpenter during the week and their labour on the weekends, they built accommodation for themselves and a shed to house all his interests ranging from food production to art. Petra even left work in March 2018 to project manage the build, something she admits she never really wanted to do. And looking back, she says the experience taught her an important money lesson. Never make a major financial decision unless your goals truly align. It wasn't my dream, she said, but I wanted him to have it because it made him very happy. As to what they spent, she has no idea because money, whether from income or debt, just got poured into it and she lost track and just gave up. She does know that their mortgage was close to $1 million by the time it was all finished. But one habit did continue and she made much bigger payments towards the mortgage, and this behaviour was to serve her well in the years ahead. Now, an accountant had suggested that they register the lifestyle property for GST and run it as a small business. Now, I hear this a lot, and a lot of people get quite excited about the taxes they think they can claim back. But more often than not, things get complicated. The idea was that if he sold his art, bought equipment for his hobbies, or leased the land for grazing, there could be tax advantages. I think that we are too quick to add accounting complexity to a small business idea, which is often otherwise known as a hobby. But for whatever reason, the structure was never properly set up and they never separated their personal finances from what was meant to operate as a business. It was just a bit of a big mess, Petra said. With the lifestyle property finally completed, though, he decided in late 2019 to take a career break for a year or two, and in his early 50s, after a long and enjoyable and successful career, he left work to focus on his many projects and passions, with plans to eventually transition into a completely new career that he was excited to be studying for on the side. Petra adored James completely and loved to see him happy. She describes him as kind, lovely and gorgeous, joking that while her friends complained about their husbands, hers only got better with age. He sounded like a guy just brimming with ideas and enthusiasm. Now, thanks to his years of earning and a large final payout, Petra had managed to put aside around $250,000 in cash, which they felt was more than enough to live on during his career break and transition into something new. Ideally, after some time off, he planned to spend half the week earning money and the other half pursuing his passions, an idea Petra fully supported because it meant more time together, given she was not working either. He embraced life completely, and there was never a budget. He grew hops to brew his own beer, he researched and collected wine, he built things, he painted things, and he immersed himself in his endless stream of ideas and projects. But as the months passed, Petra was aware that they were burning through their savings much faster than she had anticipated. A day was coming when they would fully deplete their cash reserves. However, heartbreakingly, life as she knew it came to a shuddering halt, and James never got the chance to begin the new career he was so excited about. Just 15 months into his break, tragically, in early 2021, he died suddenly, aged only 53. Petra and her children were absolutely devastated to lose such a vibrant light in their lives and were left rudderless as they dealt with their grief. And as her head cleared, it fell to Petra to try to find and then tie up all the many and varied parts of her husband's very dynamic life. Very fortunately, she knew he had life insurance. He had always insisted on having it, saying, "If I die, you won't have to worry. You will have enough." It had been costing them a lot of money each month, but in hindsight, he was right, and it was absolutely worthwhile. She rang their insurer, who immediately advanced $35,000 to help cover funeral costs and immediate expenses. The remainder would be paid once the death certificate was issued. Now, this $35,000 advance was needed because by then their once substantial $250,000 savings had dwindled to just $20,000. With the world in the thick of COVID, though, Petra became one of the many forced to farewell a loved one during the pandemic. It was a dreadful time in our lives, she said. James was deeply loved by many people, and having to say goodbye without so many being able to be there in person made an already devastating loss even harder. And then, having laid her beloved husband to rest, she couldn't find his will. They had done one together about 20 years prior, a mirror will where she left everything to him and vice versa, but she couldn't locate it. So she got in contact with the solicitor that they'd used, and while they managed to track down a document about powers of attorney, proof that she was indeed talking to the right firm, for whatever reason, the firm could not find any record of a will, none at all. Now, this was a massive issue because, in effect, James died intestate without a will, and that was where a tough situation got so much harder for Petra. Even though they were married, without a will, it doesn't mean all his assets, whether in his name only or joint, come to her. And in her grief, she just didn't know where to turn. She was in total shock. So she asked that same solicitor to manage as much of the paperwork as they could for her, and they did. But poorly, she said, and their simple and frequent mistakes added to her grief and prolonged the agony of it all. And so began interactions with lawyers and courts, both here and in Australia, to publicly put the call out to find if there was anyone with a claim to his estate. Now, this is normal for someone who has died without a will. No one came forward, and the complicated process began to track down his investments and bring them under her name. All up, over the course of a good year plus, she spent about $21,000 on these legal matters. Because he died without a valid will in place, Petra didn't automatically inherit his entire estate, despite them being married. In New Zealand, when someone dies intestate, there are strict legal rules around how an estate is divided, and it also depends on how assets are legally owned. Petra was entitled to receive all personal chattels, around $155,000 of cash, plus 1/3 of the remaining estate. This includes shares, superannuation funds, housing, and what have you. Now keep in mind, these were assets they had very much created together, and in their will, had they found it, they would have all gone to Petra. But without a will, their 3 children were legally entitled to equally divide the other 2/3 between themselves. Now, Petra says it was an awful process. She had to arrange independent legal advice for the children, who were advised of their legal entitlements and the fact that they could claim against their father's estate. Had they done so, for them to receive their financial share, it may have forced the sale of major assets like the farm and the house and the shares. Instead, the children agreed to relinquish their claims so Petra could inherit it all and continue managing the investments as one pool of money. Her promise to them was simple. She would do everything she could to grow that money and support them all over time, helping where she could with holidays, opportunities, and future needs whenever the money allowed. Can you just imagine the situation and how hard it would be? They are a loving and tight family, and Petra vowed and declared that as per their original intentions when they wrote the lost will, she would manage the family's money to the best of her ability for the good of all of them over time. They amicably and legally worked it all out, but in a different family, this could have gone a different way. Now, what is the answer to avoid these awkward conversations? Get a will today and update it and check it annually so you know it's current and you and your descendants know where it is. Now, to learn more about all this situation, it is worth Googling dying without a will because it's a really complex situation to wrap your head around. Suffice to say, 2 to 3 months in, getting involved and sorting it all out was what got Petra through. She began making phone calls to locate his company shares or find information about his Australian superannuation fund, both of which were in his name only and very complex for her to access, given he died intestate. As for dealing with the life insurance payout, that was actually pretty quick and easy, and relatively quickly she was paid out a total, including the advance, of about $710,000. This gave her some immediate financial stability. It was a real lifeline, given their savings had been so low, and it also gave her something that she was really craving, a sense of security and control. At the time of James's death, their total debt was down to $650,000. Those extra payments made on their Auckland home had made a big dent over the years, so she instructed her mortgage advisor that she was going to pay it in full. Now, their advice sounded absolutely tone deaf to me, given what she was going through, and they advised her not to do so because she might want to use it to buy more property, which was the absolute last thing on her mind. It smacked of a mortgage broker desperate to hold onto a client. And she paid it off in full and was now 100% debt-free on 2 properties. She now had far fewer monthly outgoings, plus she had a cash buffer in her bank for her and the kids. Regarding the farm, she was to learn that he had not done any tax returns for the time they had had it, so that was a mess she also needed to sort out, which she did. Now, I've heard this before from people who were left to sort out the estate of a person who has died. It is an enormous amount of work, which takes a lot of unpaid time and energy to sort through. Thankfully, Petra was not working at this time, which was just as well because this took well over a year to sort out. She became increasingly driven to track down any money that was his and therefore theirs, and she wanted to get it under her own control. She was constantly phoning his Australian super about what she needed to do and about when the money would be released to an Australian bank account and then brought into a New Zealand one. And once she had located it all, she was going to do her level best to make that money last the rest of her life, giving herself the ability not to work and to support their children too. Now, because of this promise to her children, although suppressed for so many years, her innate budgeting skills started to show themselves again. When she received his $210,000 KiwiSaver payout, she added this to the money she now needed to manage for the good of the family. Increasingly, she was taking control of every single thread of their financial lives. For the best part of a year, she sat at her kitchen table sorting through the legal work involved in settling his estate. His company shares in particular took a year to be transferred to her name, while at the same time trying to teach herself about money management and investing. And with money sitting in the bank and more expected, her accountant suggested she go and get some financial advice. Like many people, she started simply by Googling investing, which, as you can imagine, threw up all sorts of information. One of the first things she stumbled across on YouTube was Winning the Loser's Game, which she said explored how fund managers operate and how investing in the share market really works. The documentary featured interviews with John Bogle, the founding father of index investing, economists and investment experts, all explaining the same core idea that for most people, low-cost passive index funds outperform actively managed funds over the long term. And I think this is where the student was finally willing, so the teacher did appear. And what really struck her was a discussion around fees. Actively managed funds and financial advisors charge fees, and over time, those fees compound against you, quietly eating away at your wealth. The simpler, lower-cost options suddenly started to make a lot of sense. Curious, she kept digging. She watched more videos about investing, read about Vanguard and the story behind index funds. She discovered J.L. Collins and The Simple Path to Wealth, and slowly began piecing everything together. While balancing grief, legal paperwork, and learning, she became fascinated by the idea that investing could actually be simple. But rather than immediately accepting it, she became determined to disprove it. Surely it couldn't really be this straightforward. So she actively searched for arguments against low-cost passive investing, trying to find someone credible who could convincingly explain why it wouldn't work. She also began reading Mary Holm, whose writing gave her confidence and eventually prompted her to move her own KiwiSaver into a higher growth fund. And the more she researched, the more she kept circling back to the same conclusion. Simple, low-cost investing made a lot of sense. It was a revelation. How had she never known about this, she said. In late 2021, she went to see 3 different financial advisors to understand what they had to offer, and each time she was given the standard risk profile quiz, and one question in particular stood out. How would you feel if your investment account lost money? And she said, well, of course, you'd feel pretty devastated. Who wouldn't? But she quickly realized that this type of question is incredibly misleading, and she came to understand that temporary drops in value are expected when investing for long-term growth, and that avoiding growth assets altogether because markets fluctuate, it can actually be the bigger financial risk over time. Now, the common advice from all 3 of those advisors was to sell the individual stocks, sell the farm, keep her home, and let them invest and manage the rest of her money for her for a fee, of course. Next, as best as she could, and doing so is not easy at all, she worked out that the fees charged by them at that time averaged around $24,000 a year, money that was no longer working for her in her portfolio. Poof, gone. Over time, she would take a massive financial hit because of these fees. But she thought, hang on, for months now, I have been on a steep learning curve of educating myself. I've been learning the theory, at least. What if I saved on fees and I managed it myself, leaving more money invested for her whānau? So she contacted each of these 3 institutions and politely said, thank you, but no thank you. And they wished her luck, intimating that she was going to need it. With the decision made to manage and invest her own money, she continued the time-consuming process of bringing his Australian superannuation and Australian life insurance to New Zealand. Both were worth about $600,000 Australian apiece. This was a bundled product of some kind, she said. The 2 came together, but they did total around 1.2 million Australian dollars. Now, to transfer the money, she used Wise because their fees were lowest, but at that time there was actually a $40,000 daily limit as to how much she could transfer to New Zealand. Additionally, and it took a good part of a year, but finally the shares, all $780,000 of them, were paid out and brought over here too. Here in New Zealand, that money joined his $710,000 life insurance payout and his $210,000 KiwiSaver fund that was now paid out to her. So, all up, she would eventually receive 2 superannuation payouts, 2 life insurance payouts, and shares. While they might not have paid too much attention to money over the years, they absolutely did a few things well. Consistent investment into a retirement account, taking advantage of a company share scheme, and having life insurance to make up for any shortfall. James was true to his word in that if he died, she would have enough and would not have to worry about money. Now she just has to manage and grow it. Does she now have life insurance of her own? No. She has plenty to get by financially now, and with no debt, if she were to die, her heirs will be well catered for because of this. Now, it was in late 2021 that she contacted me, and by then she had already done most of the hard work of untangling James's financial life and figuring out exactly where all the assets and liabilities were. but she was still working on getting them all under her name. Honestly, it took ages. But the next step was to start planning ahead to create a financial future for both herself and her children. Now, more than anything, she just wanted someone to talk things through with, which we did. Now, I don't have any financial qualifications and I can't give financial advice, but I do seem to have a particular knack for having a good old chat about things. And by the time our paths crossed, she knew that she could manage her own money. She just needed to talk out loud with someone far removed from her situation, but really interested in it too. Now, while she didn't want to hand over her money to a financial advisor to invest on her behalf into actively managed products they had chosen and would continue to personally financially benefit from, she was still very open to getting professional advice on the plans she had already started putting together herself. She said to me, "Ruth, I know I can do this myself with the right guidance and resources." So I put her in touch with Your Money Blueprint. He is a rarity in the fact that they are a fee-only financial advisor. Now, in today's money, she paid them about $2,800 for a full financial overview of her situation, and that gave her clarity and confidence. But importantly, it still left the decision-making in her hands. And from there, she was able to open her own accounts, choose her own investments, and move forward with the plan she understood and felt comfortable managing herself. She wanted to become work optional, and she knew that if she created the right financial plan now, she could achieve this. Now, after our chat and on a whim, she decided to reread the life insurance policy just for a bit of fun. And this was where she learned something important that she insisted I share with you. Read your insurance policy. Almost a year after the death of her beloved husband, as she was starting to come out the other side of being blindsided by his loss, she read her policy and discovered 4 wonderful benefits that she had been completely unaware of. Now, the first benefit was the option to suspend premiums for 6 months after the death of the policyholder, while still remaining fully covered and able to make a claim during that time if needed. Insurance premiums add up, and it would have taken a weight off her shoulders to pause those payments had she known she could. The second benefit was a lump sum payment for grief counselling following the death of the policyholder, something both her and her children really needed at the time. The third benefit was that on the first anniversary of the policyholder's death, and then for each of the following 3 years, all medical insurance premiums paid during that year would be refunded. So effectively, she would continue paying her premiums as normal each month, but at the end of each year, on the anniversary of James's death, she would receive a full refund of those premiums for the next 3 years. And lastly, there was also a lump sum payment available for financial or legal advice relating to the life insurance payout. Now, as you can imagine, Petra was delighted to discover these benefits, but also incredibly frustrated that when she rang the insurance company after his death, back in February, nobody said, by the way, let me draw your attention to these benefits that you may want to take advantage of during this immensely sad and difficult time. This information would have made a huge difference at the time of his death because funds were getting low because they had both been taking a break from work. Suddenly, she had a funeral to pay for, along with what eventually became a substantial legal bill because James died without a will. Now, unfortunately, because there were time limits attached to these benefits, they had effectively expired by the time Petra learned about them, but she didn't let it stop her. She contacted the insurance advisor and asked him to advocate on her behalf to have those benefits reinstated. She also pointed out that surely during one of the hardest episodes of their client's life, they should be one of the very first things discussed when someone rings to notify them of a policyholder's death. Now, they didn't pay out the full amounts, but thankfully, Petra managed to get some benefits reinstated. Now, Petra was adamant about sharing this, and she encourages you to read your policy annually, or if you are supporting someone who has lost someone, offer to read their policy documents for them at the time so they know what support and entitlements may be available to them when they need it most. Now, eventually, and piece by piece, his estate was finalised and the money was hers to manage, and slowly she put it all to good use. She initially did what was suggested by her financial advisor, which was a mix of 60-40 shares and bonds. However, as she began to read more and more, she decided to forego the bonds, which she sold. So today, this is how Petra's money is invested. Outside of KiwiSaver, she uses InvestNow as her provider, and I've tried to find return figures that are before fees and taxes, which is always a wee bit tricky. She holds approximately 1.46 million in the Vanguard International Shares Select Exclusions Index Fund. The low-fee passive index fund has 5-year returns of almost 16%. She has $138,000 in the Smart Emerging Markets ESG ETF with a 5-year return of 9.4%, and $254,000 in the Foundation Series US Dividend Equity Fund. Now, by my estimation, a $250,000 investment in this dividend fund would currently generate about $9,500 a year in quarterly distributions based on today's yield. Now, this is a combined investment total of about $1.85 million. In addition, she also has around $225,000 invested in the Colonel S&P Global Dividend Aristocrats Fund. Now, this is another dividend-paying fund, and the reason she has these is her way of providing a semi-reliable regular income in the future. Again, and it's a bit of a guess, but by my calculations, this fund could generate around $11,500 a year in dividend income based on the fund's latest yield. Now, her own KiwiSaver is invested in the InvestNow Foundation Series Total World Fund with a balance of roughly $164,000 and 3-year returns of almost 22%. Now, InvestNow, Smart and Colonel are all the lowest fee index fund or ETF providers in New Zealand, and I can see that she has created a mix of funds that provide regular dividends and also funds that are globally invested and will be volatile in the short term, but will grow over time. From them, she can sell off shares as she needs them using her version of the 4% rule, and she can use that money to fund her life. Along the way, she received a lot of financial advice, and she was also advised to sell all of James's company shares to avoid having too much money tied up in a single stock. But initially, she struggled emotionally to let them go, finally selling them recently and investing the money in one of her funds instead. Now, I couldn't help but mention just on those individual stocks for a moment. Whilst owning them worked out okay and the value rose, looking back now, Petra realises they were far too heavily invested in one single company and not diversified enough. It can be very easy when you work for a company and are given shares to forget those shares still come with risk. You work there, you know the people, you hear the updates, and that familiarity creates a false sense of security. But in reality, you may be tying your income, your career, and investments to the same business, which is effectively one stock in one company, in one sector, in one country. And history shows how dangerous that can be. An example is when American company Enron collapsed in 2001, and thousands of employees didn't just lose their jobs, they lost much of their retirement savings too, because so much of their wealth was tied up in a company stock. Taking shares can absolutely make sense when they're offered, but when the chance comes to sell, it's often smarter to do so and diversify that money into a broad global ETF or index fund instead. And if your company truly succeeds, it'll probably still be in that fund anyway. I can see that Petra has some duplication within her portfolio, but currently she does not foresee any significant changes to her investments in the short term, other than increasing them when possible. In time, she intends to sell the farm and either invest the proceeds or purchase another property that will become her retirement home. The Auckland house will then likely be sold once the housing market improves, and ultimately her intention is to own only one property and hold the remainder of her portfolio in shares that will provide her plenty of income to live a pretty awesome life, just like James would want for her. Now, regarding the farm, selling it initially felt both complicated and deeply personal, so for years Petra held onto it, eventually renting it out instead. Now, currently it generates approximately $400 a month from grazing and $1,800 a month from the house tenant, a modest return relative to the value of that asset. However, Petra actually now feels emotionally ready to let it go and intends to sell the property in the near future, investing the proceeds into the share market to create a more flexible and accessible source of income. Now, with so much information coming at her, settling on her investment mix took time, and her mix is still evolving as she continues to research and learn. As money gradually arrived back in New Zealand, she invested it in stages, and she said to me, "Ruth, you can learn the theory, but it's not until you start investing and watching it over time that you really learn." So she will continue to refine it over time. And one thing I always say to people in a situation like this is to take your time. If that money sits in the bank for a year or two while you make the right decision, that is fine. There is no rush. You have decades ahead. So what's a year or two? And this is where returning to a financial advisor can make a lot of sense. Once you have had time to implement your version of their plan, having another conversation about how it is actually all playing out over a year or two and how you feel it's going can be really useful. Now, following the advice of those opinions she valued, Petra has also maintained a substantial cash buffer as she is no longer working. She values the security and flexibility that cash in the bank provides because it leaves the bulk of her money invested so it can grow, and it also shields her if share markets go down for a period. She says she spends approximately $85,000 per year and currently holds about $280,000 in cash and term deposits, which includes an emergency fund. She believes this represents approximately 3 years' worth of living expenses in cash reserves. She will likely need to sell some shares periodically to replenish these reserves and maintain around 3 years' worth of expenses in cash on hand. Now, these days, Petra budgets meticulously, often planning a full year ahead because it gives her a sense of certainty and control. She wants to know exactly where her money is, how accessible it is, and what her future expenses look like month by month. For now, she is trying hard to avoid selling down her investments, preferring to leave them untouched for as long as possible, although she knows she will eventually need to top up her cash reserves. But this is the whole point of share investing, to pull off an income every year, leaving the bulk of it to grow and compound. And while it feels a little bit nerve-wracking in the beginning, I know plenty of people who soon settle into a monthly, quarterly, or annual sell-off just to put money in their bank account to fund their fabulous lives. To simplify her life, she remains debt-free, and she sold many possessions and became far more intentional with her money. She has an updated will, one that won't go missing, and for the first time she started tracking her net worth monthly, budgeting ahead and setting money aside for future projects. To feel that in control felt amazing, she said. Now today her Auckland home is worth around $1.65 million and the farm worth about $965,000. And she estimates her total net worth, including both those properties, at approximately $5.1 million. So, with over half of her net worth invested, by my calculations, she has ample invested to safely sell off a chunk each year to fund her lifestyle. Adding the proceeds of selling the farm to her investments, it will provide her another $40,000 to $50,000 of spending money each year, based on the 4 to 5% rule, and based on her money being invested in a total world type ETF. Now, when discussing her children, Petra explained that each of them now has a will in place. Now, we didn't explore this area in depth during our discussion, partly due to time constraints and also because it's ultimately their story to tell. But Petra shared that she intends to support her children financially over time and that these conversations have been discussed openly as a family. However, she still acknowledged that she is still finding her way when it comes to managing her own finances, settling into investing and adjusting to this next stage of life. At present, her focus is on establishing her own sense of financial security and stability, essentially putting on her own oxygen mask first. And once she feels confident and settled in that position, she intends to lean more fully into supporting her children financially. Her intention is to give money into their index fund investments when she is able to do so. And she would also like to assist with significant purchases such as contributing towards a car or helping with a house deposit or tertiary study costs if needed. Beyond financial support, Petra also enjoys paying for meaningful experiences and special occasions, such as international family holidays and just lots of shared experiences together. But there was something pretty cool that I did want to share. In a late 2021 email to me, she wrote, "I also spoke to my children last night, Ruth, and I bought them a pizza as a treat, and I explained how I was going to get us all investing in index funds and how easy and exciting it was." Now, one child was already somewhat familiar with investing through having listened to podcasts and was immediately on board. Her youngest thought it sounded brilliant, while her middle child stayed pretty quiet, likely distracted by their university exams. But soon after, Petra did set up investment accounts for each of them, and she invested $5,000 into the SmartShares US 500 ETF fund in each child's name with one rule. They weren't allowed to sell, only add to it when they could. Now, at first they weren't especially interested, but trusted that Mum knew what she was doing. The eldest began contributing $100 a month, the middle child $50 a month, while the youngest contributed nothing at all. And by early 2025, Petra noticed that the fund or the unit price had risen from $12.59 per unit to $19.10 per unit. So Petra messaged each kid and just casually suggested that they check their balances, and they were gobsmacked. Even the youngest child's investment had grown by more than 50% without adding another cent, and because of the contributions of the others, their funds had doubled. That became the light bulb moment for her kids. Suddenly they understood compounding, and her youngest immediately started making more regular contributions, not only to the fund, but to their KiwiSaver as well. Now, Petra says none of her children earn huge incomes, but that's exactly the point she now tries to teach them. You don't need to earn massive money to build wealth. Small, consistent investments over time can eventually create freedom and choices in life. And she explained to them the biggest advantage young people have, God willing, is time. And she explained that spending less than you earn, drip feeding investments with that gap, and just sticking to a budget can quietly transform your future. Their father showed this by the size of his 2 superannuation accounts. Drip feeding works over time. These days, sharing what she has learned has become one of Petra's passions, which is why she's always recommending resources like Moi, the Happy Saver, and Rebel Finance School as great places to start. Now, when I asked what keeps her awake at night about money, Petra said nothing. In fact, she's become deeply passionate about personal finance because she believes anyone can improve their situation if they have the willingness to learn and take action. You start with what you have, she says. Get your spending in order, and she believes the concepts themselves are actually quite simple. And as she well knows, the hard part is consistently doing it. For Petra, learning about money over the last couple of years has given her freedom and confidence in the ability to make choices in life. This time, when the financial sun shone on her, albeit under the most terrible circumstances, she is not letting this financial opportunity slide by, and she is making the absolute best of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And when reflecting on the transition from managing finances as a couple to managing everything independently, Petra said, and with no disrespect to the beautiful James, that she is much happier having full control over her finances. Managing money on her own has given her a greater sense of autonomy, clarity, and freedom in decision-making. And Petra shared that when she is in a position to be generous with the people she loves, she embraces that wholeheartedly, and when she's not, she feels very comfortable setting those boundaries as well. For her, spreading the love brings immense joy and meaning. She spoke warmly about her upcoming holiday to Europe with her kids, describing it as a gift not only to them but also to herself, an experience that reflects the value she places on connection and generosity and making those shared memories. So having come a very long way over the last 5 years, there is such a sense of calm about Petra now, which really brings me such a sense of relief for her. So I'm almost at the end, but before I wrap up, another message from today's fabulous sponsor. If your finances are holding you back from living the life you want, try PocketSmith out. They've got the tools to help you make money management easier. And have we got a deal for you? Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of PocketSmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/thehappysaver. That's pocketsmith.com/thehappysaver. Now, after our interview, Petra sent me one final email, and honestly, it felt like the kind of perfect ending to her story. She wrote that while many people spend decades saving for retirement only to become fearful of spending once they finally have enough, she doesn't see money that way anymore. At 60, she's careful and she's intentional, but she's not fearful. These days, she's actively decluttering after a lifetime of accumulating things because material possessions increasingly feel less important to her than freedom, time, connection, and creating experiences. Since James died, she's made a conscious decision not to wait for some day. She's travelled to Nepal, Turkey, Italy, Germany, and the UK, and at the time of writing, she was preparing for another trip through Europe with 2 of her 3 children. But what struck me most about Petra's story wasn't the size of her portfolio, which is pretty decent. It was the transformation in her confidence. For most of her life, Petra managed the household budget, but she never fully understood the bigger picture of their finances. And it wasn't until she was forced to untangle everything after James's death that she truly learned how investing, wealth building, insurance, wills, and long-term planning all worked together. And I think there are a few powerful lessons in that for all of us. The first one is, you know what I'm going to say here, get a will. Not next year, not eventually, now. Because the emotional and financial stress caused by dying intestate added an enormous amount of pain during an already devastating period. Second, know where your money is. Not just your spending, but your investments, your insurance policies, KiwiSaver, superannuation, your debts, and the ownership structures and important documents. One organised folder and a few shared conversations can make an enormous difference to the people you love who are left behind. Third, simple investing works. Petra is not a professional investor. She's someone who became curious. She educated herself. She asked questions. She paid for targeted advice when she needed it, and then consistently implemented a long-term plan. Fourth, insurance played a big part in her feeling financially secure today. You insure the things you can't cover yourself, and it is important to have the right cover at the right time in your life. And finally, money is really about options. The ability to step back from work, to help your children, to travel, to give, to recover, to breathe, and just to survive life when life becomes very, very hard. Money did not protect Petra from grief, but learning how to manage it gave her stability and confidence and choices during the hardest chapter of her life. And perhaps that, for me, was the real takeaway from this episode. Financial independence is not really about becoming rich. It's about creating enough security and flexibility that when life changes, as it inevitably does, you still have choices. So a huge ngā mihi nui, a huge thank you to Petra for trusting me enough to share such a personal story. And thank you to Petra for recently reviving that original email chain and updating me on where life has taken you since. I wish you all the very best for whatever exciting adventures lie ahead, and I look forward to hearing from you again from time to time. So that's all from me this week. If you want to get in touch, you know you can find me over at my blog, The Happy Saver, where I just share a lot of information about how I manage money in my life. Thanks for listening to this episode today. I hope you took a few nuggets of wisdom from it that you can now go and apply to your own life. And please do share The Happy Saver with your friends. It is the best way that people can learn about the podcast, and I would love it if you would talk more about money with your own friends and whānau and help me continue to help others be better with money. So until next time, happy saving.